Thank you for watching this online class presentation from Cedarville University. Cedarville offers undergraduate majors with 3-year completion plans, plus bachelor's to master's accelerated completion options. It's a great way to save money and enter your career field earlier. We invite you to learn more at cedarville.edu.
So today we want to take a look at the book of Leviticus. And how about that reading? Good stuff, right? I mean, that just really engages you. How many people have you ever heard who said, I was going to read through the entire Bible, and they did well with Genesis, and Exodus was a little harder, and then they got to Leviticus, and oh man, all their plans just went downhill, right? So maybe we can say, to be honest, that actually Leviticus is God's only literary failure. Now, I suppose you might be surprised that I would say that, but the only thing that's surprising is that we actually wrote it, because everybody has thought that before. When you get into the book, it just seems like, man, this just doesn't have the same continuity as all the other books. It's so strange and so different. But I would like to argue that Leviticus is actually an unrecognized piece of literary art. This is a beautiful composition that's put together and communicates powerfully. One of the ways we know that is because the very first word of the text is "and." And you might say, well, why does that make it literary art? Well, because it communicates so clearly. What it's saying is this is a continuation of the story. Almost any Bible translation you look at just kind of brushes over this. A couple of them say then and some say now, but literally it is simply "and," because this is a continuation of what went before. So in order to understand what Leviticus is really all about, you have to go back to the previous chapter. If you remember, we did this with Exodus as well. In order to begin Exodus, we started where Genesis finished. So what this means is this. We ask ourselves, how did the previous book finish? And it finished with this. Remember who just moved into the neighborhood. Everybody else dwells in tents, and now God moves in to the neighborhood. Now, I don't know that this picture is actually true to life. I doubt that everyone had circus tents that were pretty colored and striped, but you get the idea. What I do love about it is that you see everyone living in tents, and God lives in a tent too. So God actually tabernacles among them. He puts on what they have on. You can't help but move, of course, to John chapter 1, where it says that Jesus tabernacled among us. He put on flesh just like we have. And so you see the whole process beginning here. God comes down in a tent just like everybody else has a tent. But here's the problem. When you get to Exodus chapter 40 and verse 35, the text says Moses could not enter the tent of meeting because the glory of the Lord filled it. Now, you might just read that over historically and say, well, I guess that's the way it was. But if you're really following along with the story, you realize this is a romantic story where God wins the girl and God marries the girl, and now he's going to live with the girl. And if in fact Moses goes over to his house and God says, no, we're locking the doors, you can't come in, that's like a deal breaker. That's a showstopper. That's something's wrong. Something has to answer that. Why in the world would God go to all the work to live among the people if when Moses came over, God wouldn't even let him in the front door? Well, that's why we need this book. Right? How do we talk with our new neighbor? How do we go over his house for dinner? And so the book of Leviticus says, here's how you do that. You bring the right kind of sacrifice. You bring the right kind of gift. There's a certain protocol for walking in the front door. So let me show you what you need to get into the front door. And I hope it reminds you of this line, hey, great-grandpa Adam, how do we get back in? Because in that story we saw a couple weeks ago, we were talking about the Garden of Eden, and we saw the cherubim there, and the kids wanted to get back in the garden. We want to get in, but we can't get in. The same kind of thing, because in a lot of ways, the tabernacle is like a Garden of Eden. In fact, let me show you a couple of pictures of it now, and then take you inside. This is actually a replica of the tabernacle that someone has erected in southern Egypt, in southern Israel rather. And you can certainly see the size of it. It's not impressive. It's just kind of a homely little tent. And you can understand why David would come along and say, God, this is wrong that you live in this mobile home. Let me build you a permanent palace, right? It's a very humble kind of place to live. So as you take a look at the breastplates of the high priest, and you take a look at a cutaway version of the temple, again, temple, different than the tabernacle, but they certainly look the same inside. What you're impressed with is this. Let me move closer in. And you can see inside here, you see a sort of a cutaway into the Holy of Holies. It's all gold. There are cherubim. There are palm trees. There are flowers. And to someone who has been conversant with the story of the Bible so far, you look at all this and you say, wow, where was the last place where there was cherubim and flowers and palm trees and gold and God's presence? And of course the answer is, that was the Garden of Eden. And that's exactly what this is supposed to look like. We were moving back toward the Garden of Eden. Now, we're certainly not there yet, but it's a good step in that direction. So that brings us then to how we get in there. And the way we get in there is with the necessary conditions. First of all, with the right sacrifices. So we'll begin with the person involved, and if you are in fellowship in chapters 1, 2, and 3, then there are 3 different options of sacrifices you can bring. First of all, there's the burnt offering. So if you say to yourself, I want to go over to God's house, I want to go into His house and fellowship with Him and spend time with Him, God says, fine. Here's the first option you have. You're going to have 3, but here's the first one in Leviticus chapter 1. And so it's a burnt offering. And what you're saying is, I'm all in. The reason you're saying that is because the burnt offering is completely burned up. Other offerings later, things called meal offerings or peace offerings, you actually would put the animal on the altar and you would, part of it would be burned up, but part of it would be cooked, and you could take it off and actually eat it and have a meal in God's presence, right? Now I'm kind of getting ahead of myself. This is chapter 3. But the point is, with the burnt offering, chapter 1, it's just all given over. So the very first big idea, the very first lesson from the first chapter is, if you want to have fellowship with God, you've got to be all in. You put your hand on that animal, it represents you, it's completely burned up, it's given over. The very first lesson. Look, if you want to experience God, you can't do it halfway. Right? As James says, you who are double-minded, bad idea. You can't be half in, half out. And this is part of the trouble, the catch-22 with people who say, well, I tried God. Well, you can't try God. You have to be all in. And so the lesson here certainly is that. Now, it also breaks down this way, in that you can bring a bull or a sheep or a goat or a dove or a pigeon. I think you can pretty well figure out the big ones are really expensive and the small ones are not expensive. And that again has a lesson here. God says, look, I want to make sure anybody who wants to can have fellowship. And so I don't really care if you're rich or poor. Even if you're poor and all you can offer is a little bird, that's cool. You come, you are welcome here. So that's the first one for those who are in fellowship. The second one is a grain offering. And in the Middle East, grain, bread, is the basic substance of life. It's the basic diet. Today we think it's meat because we're really rich, relatively. But in the Old Testament, and especially in the Middle East, and a lot around the world today, bread is what is for dinner, right? Bread is what you live by. Men don't live by bread alone, right? So the grain offering is saying, God, we're grateful for life. We're grateful you've given us life, and so we want to express that and come to you. That gratefulness is a really basic, really important response of worship. So much so that in Romans chapter 1, Paul describes the opposite for the world that's out of control and says, the trouble is that people didn't recognize God for who He was, nor did they give thanks. Because if you recognize who God is, you can say, thank you, God, for what you've done for me. Finally, the third one is a meal offering or a peace offering, sometimes even called a fellowship offering. And this is like having dinner with God. Now, it's not exactly like having meal around a table and leaning your head back on Jesus' chest. Hope you're thinking forward here to the Last Supper, right, and to John and that kind of intimate fellowship. We're not there yet, right? And you can't even go into that holy place. Again, you're just kind of out in the courtyard. But it's a step there. So you could go and offer your offering and get part of it back and eat it there sort of in the courtyard. Now, I don't know if that seems like an interesting thing to you or not, but I just have a sense that it would be a lot more meaningful if you could really experience that. Many years ago, took my family to Washington, D.C. We loved going there for vacation. We'd been there 4 days, and everybody was tired. Kids were little, like 7, 9, and 12. They were little. We were all tired of D.C. I mean, we loved it, but it was time to go. And we'd seen everything we wanted to see except for the White House, right? And my wife said, no, we're not going till we go take a tour of the White House. And so, believing strongly in the aphorism that ain't nobody happy unless mama's happy, we decided to stay. And so she stood in line to get tickets to go into the house, right? And we had to park the car. Well, on the way back, many blocks away, we parked the car. On the way back, this homeless guy comes by and says, hey, if you want to see the president, he's down there. We looked, there was no president down there. It was like he just, seeing we're from out of town, yanking our chain. And then we saw a couple of Secret Service guys running this way, right? And we thought, oh my goodness, maybe he's right. And it was summertime, they're all decked out in their black Under Armour for, jogging. And they said to us, you're gonna have to step back from the sidewalk, right? With these little earpieces in. So it was like, okay, we stepped back. We thought, this is kind of cool. We'll get to see the president come by. And sure enough, down there, coming towards us, was the president of the United States by himself, was Bill Clinton. And we thought, this is cool, watch him go by. But he didn't go by. He jogged up to where we were, stopped, looked at us, and walked over. And he shook everybody's hand from the littlest to me, right? And it was just like, oh my goodness. Oh my goodness. And he said, hi, where are y'all from? And I couldn't remember. I'm serious, I could not. It's like, because all I could think was his legs are so white. His legs are so white. I didn't want to say that. But he was jogging. It was really kind of earthy. His hands were sweaty, and he was incredibly personable. He sat there and talked to us for a minute and a half, which may seem slow here, but if we could have thought of anything intelligent to say, I'm sure he would have stayed longer. And it was just amazing. And after we talked to him about jogging, some other chit-chat stuff, you think, how often do you do this with the President of the United States? He gets in his Suburban right there, and the Secret Service guys jump in the back, and they take off. So at this point then, we get back and we see my wife in line. So, you want to go in and see the house, huh? Yeah. Well, we just shook hands with the resident. No, you did not. Yeah, we did, right? And it was just like, it was so funny because, we wanted to go and see that house, but I tell you what, I still remember the shirt I had on that day. Last night, my daughter and her son were over to the house, and we were talking about that. Because the little guy had just done a report on Bill Clinton and said, yeah, your mommy shook hands with him, right? And it's just like, it was just so amazing, right? And that's just a human, right? And I remember the feeling we felt for days like, wow, this is, how often do you talk to the most powerful human on the planet? And just that experience was really overwhelming. And I imagine, if you could actually go to the God of the universe and have dinner in his house, even if you couldn't go into the house, would that be worth it? And I think if you were interested in God at all, this would be an amazing experience to do. Now, the good part is that even if you weren't in fellowship, you could be, because next we're going to talk about for those who are not in fellowship, whose fellowship is broken. And there are a couple different points I want to make here. There are two basic offerings, a sin offering and a guilt offering. And I want to talk to you about the position and accountability lesson in the sin offering. And I'll just say it very quickly here. If the priest sins, he has to bring a certain offering, which is really expensive. If the whole community sins, and sometimes the whole community makes a bad decision, like 10 spies voting no, they have to bring a really expensive offering. If a leader sins, it's a less expensive offering, and if Joe Average Israelite sins, it is a not nearly as expensive offering. Is that because the sins of some people are worse than others? Answer, no. All sins are equal. All sins are bad. But the point is that some people's sin affects more people than others. And here's what I'm talking about. Let's just say that someone steals $100 from the bookstore today, right? And there are three suspects. It's Sabrina, and it's me, and it's Dr. White. Now, who would you rather have be the person who's the culprit? I mean, if I'm the guy who steals $100, that's going to make all of you look bad, right? Your friends are going to say, you go to a school where your Bible professor is so lame, he steals money from the bookstore, right? But even worse, Dr. White, right? You go to school where the president is so lame, I would never go to that school, right? But of course, Sabrina does, like, college students are poor, we kind of understand, we get that, right? And the same thing is true here, that the higher your position, the more your sin affects other people. This is the very same reason why James says in chapter 3, not many of you should try to be teachers, because those of us who teach will be judged more strictly. If I teach you well, that's good, but if I teach you badly, I infect you with bad teaching, right? So the position and the accountability is clearly taught there. The second thing is I'm going to talk about the distinction between the sin and the guilt offering. Now, typically, you would think sin offering is what you offer when you mess up, right? When you sin. And guilt, just by the name of it, you'd think, well, that's what I offer when I feel really bad about it. But those are not right, okay? So if you've written those down faithfully, make sure you say, not right, okay? Because the truth is this, the sin offering is what you offer when your sin only affects you. But sometimes your sin affects other people too, and that's where you use the guilt offering, all right? So let me say it like this. You'll notice that in the guilt offering, Leviticus 6:5, it says, whatever it was he swore falsely about, he must make restitution in full, add a fifth of the value to it, and give it all to the owner on the day he presents his guilt offering. So you have to pay back some extra, 20% extra. So the guilt offering then is this, you have to add a fifth of the value. So let's go back to our bookstore thing. Poor Sabrina realizes, I shouldn't have stolen that $100, sorry, but you're sitting right here in front, right? So she steals $100, so she goes back and the next day and she gives $100 back. Does that fix the problem? Well, in terms of the book's balancing, I guess it does. But if you've ever been a waiter or a waitress, or you've been in charge of a cash register, and at the end of the day, you total things up and there's $100 missing, and your boss is there breathing down your neck, what's that feel like? Right? A few of you have had that experience. You know what I'm talking about. When that happens, the boss says, well, I don't know where the $100 went. And you say, oh my goodness, was I negligent? Did I mess up? What's wrong here? And the boss says, well, I hope you find it, but if you don't, it's coming out of your pay. You think, I only made $80 tonight, so I'm going to have to pay 20 to come, right? And you don't sleep that night because you can't find it. And the next day she brings the $100 back. Is everything good now? And the answer is no, you didn't sleep that night, right? So the $20 is to help kind of make up for that trouble that you've caused, right? So what you do here is you bring back X plus 20. Now, hopefully most of us don't go stealing $100 in the bookstore every day, right? At least I hope. I hope you don't steal $100 from the bookstore every day. That'd be kind of bad if we did. But what kind of sins do we do? Here are the kind of sins that I do. Maybe you can identify, okay? True story. A couple years ago, class has started right here in this classroom. Student comes in the back 5-10 minutes late, walks in, sits down in the back row, puts her books down, immediately puts her arms on the desk and goes to sleep. Now, I would like to say I'm a better man than this, but I'm not. All of a sudden, this is just starting to get to me. Like I'm saying, look, that's kind of insulting, I mean, am I that bad, a teacher, that you just kind of come in here and go to sleep, and why'd you come in late? I'm thinking all these things, and I'm having a hard time because I got a conversation going out my mouth to the students, and then I got this other one going inside of my head, schizophrenically, right? And so it's bothering me, and at the end of the day, end of the class period, I walk up and I determine I'm gonna give her a piece of my mind, right? So I'm up there on my way to talk to her, and she takes off before I can get back there. So what do I do? Well, what I do is I go up to my colleagues and I start to complain to them, and I say, "You'd never believe what happened to me. This student came in and she was late and she slept, and it's like, oh." And they're up there saying, "Oh, Chris, you poor professor, you deserve better than that. These students, you can't." On and on and on. Next class day we have, she comes in and I decide, okay, I'm going to go, give her a snarky comment or talk to her about it. And before I can get anything out of my mouth, thankfully, God's mercy is here, she says to me, "Dr. Miller, I just want to explain to you about last time. I really love your class. I love this class so much. And I had this incredible migraine. I was throwing up but I didn't want to miss class. And the light was really hurting my eyes, but I thought if I can just go and sit in the back row and keep my eyes closed so the light doesn't bother me, at least I can listen. Oh my God. What a total idiot I am, right? I was all upset. I caused myself all this sorts of trouble, and I thought about that. And so let's just think about that, right? So I said, oh man, I'm so sorry, about that. But then I started thinking about this, X plus 20. What had I stolen from her? I hadn't stolen $100 from her. What did I steal from her? I stole her reputation when I blabbed to my colleagues what a bad student she was, right? So how do I do X plus 20 with her? Well, I march back up to my friends and I say, look, here's the whole story. This student was really faithful. In fact, she was more faithful than I would have been. I wish everybody was this faithful. Look what she did, right? And build up her reputation plus 20%, not exactly, but you get the idea, right? You build it back up. Now, think about this just for a second. You can look at this X plus 20 and you can think, the Old Testament law gives this penalty. It's really bad. You have to, it's really hard. It's not just grace. Again, bad understanding of grace. Or you can say, what would happen just for a week, just for 1 week, if all of us in here, every time you said something stupid or bad or ugly about a roommate or a friend, and you know that we all do. James says we all mess up with our tongues. What if just for 1 week, whenever you did that, you went back and X plus 20'd it to whoever you badmouthed or whatever bad thing you said, right? Can you imagine what would happen in our community? Our community would be bonded together so strongly, it would just be absolutely amazing. And so what I want to say again, where we've talked about Torah, right, in the past, is this, that it's about cultivating, restoring relationships. And that this is an amazingly good law. And this is why Moses says, wow, what other nation has such amazing laws that produce health in us if we were to follow them? Right? Now, a lot of things to cover, not much time, so let me move on really quickly. We talked about the necessary conditions for coming to God. There are two at least. Number one is the right sacrifices, and number two, the right sacrificers. So now we're to that point where we're talking about the prescribed priesthood. So what Leviticus chapters 8 and 9 are all about is about God getting the priests ready. And at the very end of this chapter is this really culminative story where it says this: Moses and Aaron then went into the tent of meeting, right? Remember the very beginning, he couldn't get in. He go into the tent of meeting. When they came out, they blessed the people, and the glory of the Lord appeared to all the people. Fire came out from the presence of the Lord and consumed the burnt offering and the fat portions on the altar. Why? Well, because even though they go in and they bless the people, it's like, how do you know it's really a blessing? Maybe those are just hollow words, right? And God says, no, let me do a little miracle for you. Lightning comes out, evaporates the bull on the altar, and you say, okay, God's listening. Those were legitimate words of blessing to us. This system is working. And that's why when the people saw it, they all shouted for joy and fell face down. Right? I mean, they're so excited, they fall down on the ground. Why? This is an amazingly good situation. I mean, you've got a God who lives with you. You've got people who go in to intercede for you with him. And when they come back out, God says, yes, I heard them, and I'm here, and I'm present. And people say, wow, who else has this? Nobody else has this. This is amazing stuff, right? And then, in one of the most roller coaster stories ever, in one of the worst chapter divisions ever, you go to the next two verses, and it's a different story completely. And in chapter 10, verses 1 to 2, which are right after those two verses we just read, Aaron's sons, Nadab and Abihu, took their censers, put fire in them, and added incense, and they offered unauthorized fire before the Lord. Now, another one of those examples where you say, what did they really do, right? And your curiosity gets the best of you, and Moses says, doesn't matter, don't worry about it, don't try to figure it out. I'm just telling you, they did something they weren't supposed to do, and fire came out from the presence of the Lord and consumed them, and they died before the Lord. Now, you can't miss the irony here, right? 2 minutes before, fire comes out, licks up the sacrifice. Now fire comes out from heaven and licks up the sacrificers. So what would the reaction be on the people? What would this look like? And allow me just a little freedom here to say, you're sitting there with your friend, and you look at that, and Nadab and Abihu are just little charcoal smoking bits on the sand. And you're thinking, wow, right? You just had this excitement where you fell on the ground, and now you have this roller coaster valley where you look and say, oh no, they're gone, right? And your friend says, man, that was a bad system. And you say, no, I don't think it was a bad system. And he says, well, they're just sitting there, there's little crispy critters right now. Of course it's a bad system, right? You say, no, I don't think the system is bad. I think the system is good. It's just that they were bad. And your friend says, well, yeah, but if they're bad, the whole thing's bad. And you say, no, not necessarily. And he says, why not? You say, well, I'm not going to tell you because I'm afraid you would Isaac at me if I told you. And he says, no, I wouldn't Isaac at you. You say, yes, you would. You'd Isaac at me if I told you what I was thinking. He says, no, and I promise, I won't Isaac at you. So he says, okay, I know this is really, really silly, but what if we just had like a sinless high priest who would never do what he wasn't supposed to do, and therefore he could always live and make intercession for us, right? And your friend says, Isaac, right, and laughs at you. Because the thought of a sinless high priest is like so out there. Who would ever get that's laughable? Get it? I mean, that's the whole point, that this is the God who does things that most people would just laugh at. That what is going on in this system is enough to be good, but make you want something better. That you may not even know what it is yet, but you know there's something better out there God has that you want. Right? Now, with that then, let's go on to the next story. Watch how this one goes. Because now we're going to get into the problem of clean and unclean. Probably one of your favorite parts of Leviticus so far. Right? What is going on here? Well, I can't explain every bit of it, but I got a pretty good sense of the whole. So let me just say here, in 11 to 15, we are again moving to the tabernacle, but there's certain things that are going to keep you from it. There are wrong foods. There's chapter 12, childbirth and recovery, skin diseases and touching mold, and reproductive fluids and discharges from sickness. Now we'll talk about those in a second here, but let me just talk about the whole preview for a second. Let me just say this, that in this whole system of unclean and clean, do not think that unclean means sinful. It doesn't. Neither does clean equal holy. So to be unclean is not necessarily to be sinful, because these are things that happen in the course of everyday life. But what's happening is this. It's a really big, comprehensive object lesson for everybody. The death and the curse cover us. Now, you will notice, not everything up here, the foods may not fit in this category, but almost everything else here kind of goes back to the origin of the curse and of death, right? Like the pain in childbirth and the uncleanness that comes from childbirth and the skin diseases and the discharges we're going to see here. A lot of these things are a result of death and the curse. And so part of what is going on here is when you want to go to God's house, you can't be in a state of uncleanness. And you've got all this death and curse around you, and you can't carry it into God's house, so you got to get it taken care of. Now, and again, I know that's a big general idea, but just stay with me here. Let me go back and take a look at some of these individual things in terms of the foods that are unclean. When you take a look at the unclean foods, this is the definition for why you can eat a cow, but you can't eat a pig. Right? Again, we talked about part of the purpose of the foods in the very beginning, saying that they isolated you, made its social interaction difficult with the Canaanites, so they had their own purpose. But it's just another one of those things you got to watch out for if you want to go to the tabernacle. You can't eat the wrong foods. And so as you read through here, it was so funny because certain flying insects you can eat, some you can't eat. The good news is that you can eat a locust, a katydid, a cricket, or a grasshopper. Amen? Yeah, I mean, sometimes little teeth get stuck in there, but they're pretty tasty, especially a little chalk. Never mind. But here's where it gets a little bit funny, because it says some of these animals, if they're in the kitchen, for example, and they fall on a pot, you have to throw away the stuff that's in the pot and break the pot too. Or sometimes you can put it in water and clean it and it's okay. So you look at that and you think, okay, don't totally understand it, but I think I can live with it because I really want to go to the tabernacle. In chapter 12, there are unclean days for childbirth. Again, you're doing what you're supposed to, but remember, childbirth is part of under the curse now, right? Not that it's wrong to do by any means, but there's pain involved in it, just like there's pain involved in work, and so there's uncleanness that results from this. In chapters 13 and 14, there is uncleanness for people who get skin diseases, also uncleanness for mold, like the house can get some mold, and if it does, you have to tear the part out and fix it, and if you can't do that, you have to tear it down. And then in chapter 15, there are, again, strange, to us at least, strange uncleannesses for what it says are discharges. And I think this is covering all sorts of sickness. Now just imagine, you get sick, not to be too earthy here, but so you understand, you get sick, and so you're throwing up, or you have diarrhea, and then there are even sexual discharges here too. The kind of thing that typically most of us would say, when I feel that way, I don't want to go out in public anyway, right? But all these different discharges that come from being sick or unhealthy, again, make you unclean. And my favorite one is this one. If the man with the discharge spits on someone who is clean, that person must wash his clothes and bathe with water. He'll be unclean till evening, right? I mean, it just seems so random. And yet, let me see if I can give you a sense of what this is going to look like, okay? So again, give me a little liberty here. I am Joe Average Israelite. My wife and I want to take the kids to the tabernacle this weekend to have a meal with God. And so, it's Wednesday afternoon, it's 5 o'clock, I get off work and I go home. When I go home, I see the lights in the house are off, and I walk in and my wife is in a fetal position in the corner of the room with a bag over her head, all right? Now, being a sensitive guy, I walk in and I think, I think something could be wrong. So I walk up to her and I say, honey, what's wrong? And she says, I just feel terrible. It's been such a bad day. I say, honey, please tell me about your day. And she says, it's just awful because I noticed the first thing that happened was, a stupid gecko was in the kitchen and it fell off into the pot and I had to throw all the stuff away and it was my grandma's pot that she gave to me and I had to break that. And I said, that's terrible, honey. I'm really sorry. That's a bad day. She says, yeah, but it gets worse. I said, what? She says, well, you notice that I realized that it's only been 50 days since little Susie was born and I'm still unclean from that. I said, that's bad. We'll have to postpone going to the tabernacle for a week. And she says, yeah, it's worse. I said, what? She says, well, from chapter 13 and 14, I went into little Billy's bedroom and I think the wall has the creeping crud and I'm afraid we're going to tear down that part of the house. I said, that's really terrible. Is that all? She says, no, there's more. I said, what? She says, some unclean guy spit on little Joey today and I think we're never going to make it to the tabernacle, right? So I look, I say, honey, that's terrible, but don't give up hope. She says, I just don't have any hope at all. And then I say to her, you know what? There's got to be hope. And she says, well, I know that there's hope, but I don't want to say it because I'm afraid you would Isaac at me. And I said, no, I wouldn't Isaac at you. She says, yeah, you would. You'd Isaac at me. I said, well, come on, what are you thinking? She says, well, I just wish that there were one sacrifice that was so good it would take away all our sin. And I think, yeah, that'll be the day. And then I say, wait a minute. There is one of those. She says, really? Seriously? I say, yeah, there is. I was just reading about it. It's called the Day of Atonement. It's a day when all of our sins are taken all the way. She says, tell me about it. I said, take the bag off your head and they will, right? So we go then to chapters 16 and 17, the cleansing for those who approach, and we learn about the Day of Atonement, Yom Kippur, right? Or Yom Kippur, as we would say it. Yom Kippur, the Day of Atonement. And it is made up of two really important goats. So sorry. I'm sorry. If I woke somebody up, I apologize. Yeah, it's made up of the substitute goat who teaches about forgiveness. Now, here's the way he does it, okay? A substitute goat comes. You've heard probably the story before. The high priest confesses his sins and the sins of all the people on this little goat. cuts its throat, and then spreads its blood on the atonement cover in the holy place. But then there's a second goat, a slightly different sound effect, because this little guy runs away. And the beauty of this one is the same thing happens, confesses the sins on the head of the goat, but then they take him and lead him way far away, teaching the idea of the removal of our sins. God not only forgives but forgets, right, in these two little guys. And so you get a sort of a comprehensive understanding of what's actually happening here. Now, let me talk just a little bit about the blood, okay? Or what it would look like 2 days later. Everything is forgiven. We're all good. So we're feeling refreshed, kind of like you do on New Year's Day or a fresh start. And so it's 5 o'clock, and I, Joe Average Israelite, go home to see my wife. And so I get home, and I notice that the lights are off in the house again, that my wife is over in the corner again, in the fetal position again with the bag over her head. And I think, oh no, what's going on now? I say, honey, what's wrong? She says, oh, it's just a terrible day. I said, well, tell me about your day. What happened? She said, well, another gecko fell in another one of my pots, right? And I'm thinking, oh no, not the whole thing all over again. And she goes through the whole thing, and I say, but honey, there's hope, right? And she says, well, yeah. I said, well, we got another Day of Atonement. And she says, yeah, I know it's coming, but that's 363 days from now. And I just don't know if I can live like that anymore. I just wish. And I say, wish what? She says, no, I'm not going to tell you what Isaac had me. I said, come on, I won't laugh. She says, I know this sounds really, really crazy, but what if we just had a Day of Atonement that was so good that we never need another one? And my first thought is, oh yeah, that'll be the day, right? And you see here that what's going on in this book is there's this incredible thread of a deep story that it's revealing just part of, to help you recognize, wasn't that Day of Atonement good? Yeah, it was really good. Do you want another one? Yeah, I want another one next year. Another one next year? Yeah. Do you think you'd ever get tired of that? You think you'd ever just want one that was so good you never had to have another one? Right? And causes our hearts to be drawn to the bigger, better plans that God has going out there. And so, indeed, we're looking forward to a better one. So, at that point, then, it is time to talk about why this whole thing works very quickly. And why it works, notice that the method of cleansing here is the Day of Atonement, chapter 16. But what makes this whole thing work is in chapter 17, the value of blood. And again, you might wonder about this, like, why does God like blood so much? Is there something special or magical? And he talks about it here and tells us why. And he says, verse 11, the life of the creature is in the blood. I've given it to you to make atonement for yourselves on the altar. It is the blood that makes atonement for one's life. Why blood? Because of this. Because blood is an easy symbol for life. Why? Well, if we lived in a time in the culture and we watched it happen, it would be very clear. So let me explain it to you. If you've never been around farm or animals or seen this kind of thing happen, it's totally foreign to us, but this was common for all them. And when you take that little goat and you cut its throat, it does not fall over and die. Not at all. When you take that little goat and you slit its throat, it starts to pump out blood and pump out blood to the extent that you think, how in the world can one little animal have that much blood? But it just keeps pumping it out and pumping it out. And it takes a long time for this to happen, and eventually the little animal starts to get a little bit queasy. And then you can see it starting to, eyes glaze over, and it starts to get wobbly, right? And then it falls over, and it's still struggling, and it's kicking because it doesn't want to die. It wants to have life. But you can literally see the life blood flowing out of it. And as you watch this process, you realize giving up that blood is like taking away that life, right? Because that's what our sins have caused. Our sins have forfeited life, and so this little animal has to forfeit its life, and that's what the blood is the symbol of. So the blood is not, scientifically, spiritually more significant than anything else here, but it's an easy symbol that this blood is the life that you have to give up. Right? You have to have a perfect life to substitute for one that is imperfect. So that is how the cleansing works. Let me then finish with the way this book does, and that's this. It finishes with life with God, right? So that now that you've approached God, come into his house, had fellowship with him, had forgiveness with him, then you go out from his tabernacle a different person to live differently. And so what you find here then are these regulations for people who want to live like God and be like God. And I think this is the simplest way to show it to you. This is a picture of my Bible, and you will notice that in chapters 18 and 19 and 20, there is this repeated phrase, I am the Lord your God, and it is everywhere. You see this? It's just everywhere. And so when you first look at that, you think, God is saying, do this, do this, do this, because I am the Lord. Oh, it's an authoritative thing. God makes us do it because he's boss, right? And the answer is no. What it's about is this. He says, do not curse the deaf or put a stumbling block in front of the blind, because I love them. I am Yahweh. Leave grapes and food for the poor, because I am Yahweh. Love your neighbors yourself, because I am Yahweh. You see what's going on here is God is saying, here's the way I want you to live morally, because that's who I am. That's the way I am. And the whole point behind these is not simply, I've got the authority, I'm going to make you do it, but rather, I am the example I want you to follow. Or we could say it like this, right? Be this way because it's how I am. And if you are this way, you'll be little images and reflections of Yahweh, right? Or maybe a better picture is not nature, but a person, right? If you live this way, you will reflect who Yahweh is. So with that, then, let me just finish, again, the way the book does, with the feasts. And I don't have time to look at every one of these things. We might look at this in a little bit. But let me just say one thing about the feasts. There are a whole bunch of feasts going on here, and the feasts are actually snow days. That's the best way to explain it. This is not just an opportune time to tell you that. I've always felt this way. I've always said it that way. But the snow days are such an incredible relief to me. It's like, oh, praise God. I am legally bound to do nothing, right? I don't have any obligations. And that's what these were. God says, let's take 10 days off, go on a huge hike together and celebrate and spend time with each other and come back, and nobody can do any of the work. You have to do this. It's like designated snow days to give relief and worship in the calendar. This is one of the best parts of being an Israelite, right? Going up to Jerusalem 3 times and the other festivals where you would actually stay, where you lived, they were just fantastic. 2 for the past, Passover and unleavened bread, and then 2 for the present, first fruits and Pentecost, and then 3 for the future, trumpets, and actually like a shofar, the Day of Atonement, and tabernacles. We won't talk about the content of those in the test, but at least you get the idea of what they are and a little bit of what they're about. So Leviticus is, in my opinion, a pretty powerful book about fellowship with God and the future way to do that.